everyone, and welcome to Shade Podcast. Today I'm delighted to introduce our special episode from Basel, recorded by Kimunguyi. Many of you know Anne from the brilliant Artist Spotlight features that she writes for Shade Art Review. And as you know, I can't always travel, so on this occasion I was delighted that Anne took the mic and headed to the Kunstmuseum in Basel to view When We See Us, a century of black figuration in painting. And it's there where she recorded this conversation that you're about to hear with the head of contemporary art at the Kunstmuseum, Maja Wismer.
The exhibition encompasses a century of black figuration in painting, and it does so from a very broad perspective. It's my colleagues Koyokuo and Tandasani Dlakama who curated the exhibition for Sites Mocha in Cape Town. So the curatorial perspective is really from South Africa, but with a deliberate Pan-African view. The exhibition now is in its second iteration at Kunstmuseum Basel, and it encompasses a whole building. It's divided in 6 chapters. It's, I think, roughly 170 works of art, or 150 by 72 artists. I always get the numbers crossed, but it's a vast amount. All these works are divided into chapters, and the chapters sort of are distributed through the building. You can choose your own path, but you'll start, anyone entering the exhibition will start with what was the closing chapter in Cape Town, and that's the opening chapter in Basel now, and that is called Triumph and Emancipation. From Triumph and Emancipation, you'll be taking your way through a chapter that is called Spirituality, a chapter that is called Sensuality, a chapter that is called The Everyday, another one is Joy and Revelry, and the last one is Repose. And all of these chapters take as the sort of their shared characteristics of the works on view in each of these chapters is Black Joy. That is the starting point. Maybe I can elaborate a bit on how my colleagues came to do this show, actually. It was during COVID from Cape Town, so also a place that was particularly harshly struck by the pandemics. Also, just noting that this is the moment when Black Lives Matter sort of has a reassurance centered around the murders of George Floyd and many others. And so there is this abundance and presence of black bodies being under threat, really having to struggle. And those are the viral images. And that in connection of living through a moment of harsh restrictions and just wanting to emphasize that this is just a very one-sided view on Black lives. And so Koyokuo and Tandasani Dlakami and their curatorial teams went on to gather images, paintings by artists coming from the African diasporas, really focusing on just positive self-depictions.
That's so interesting what you say about the way that the pandemic and the sort of strictness of lockdown and what you could access and what you engaged with all around the world really influenced the conception of this exhibition. That really nicely leads me on to my next question. So you've talked a little bit about the conception of the exhibition in terms of the ideas and how it was produced in South Africa. I'm really curious to know what you think it means for these works to be displayed in this way here in Basel, in particular, at this point in time.
That is a set of questions that my Basel colleagues and I have been discussing for almost 2 years now. So the exhibition's title, When We See Us, comes from Ava DuVernay's title of her mini-series called When They See Us. So that brings back the play with a wish for correcting the narrative in a way. And so the discussions we had in Basel from the beginning were around, so what does it mean to borrow the we in a still predominantly whitish context that Basel is? But My colleagues from South Africa pretty soon were kind of also getting bored with that question, because they were like, yes, but it's an exhibition, it's a traveling exhibition, it has a title, and of course in Basel we show exhibitions from anywhere, so why not show the one from Cape Town that is called When We See Us? And when we tried to get into the different chapter texts and understand what does the first person plural do to the exhibition in Basel, we realized, as for me at Kunstmuseum Basel, it is a quotation. I quote my colleagues and the painters in the show, but for some of my colleagues and for actually many of our audiences, the we is fully the we that they step in. So bringing the show to Basel really aligns on the one hand with our interest. You mentioned the show by Kara Walker in your opening remarks. We've since also shown a show by Theaster Gates. We've had a huge Carrie Mae Weems show on view in Basel. So artworks by Black artists have already sort of found the way in narratives here. So for us, it's a primer to work with an institution from the African continent, actually. And that is the most spectacular for us. And it's also a triumph for Sites MoCA. Sites MoCA being an institution that is only, I believe, 7 years old, and us being these several hundred years old. It was a collaboration that was very inspirational on many levels and for all kinds of colleagues around it. To get back to your question, I'm absolutely proud that this show is happening here. I think it's high time that audiences in and around Basel can see these vast traditions of depictions here. And what originally triggered me to follow up in understanding whether we could bring the exhibition to Basel, indeed, is the fact that some of the artists in the exhibition are already with works in our collection. So that comes back to another wish for Koyokuo and Tandasani Dhlakama to understand where the last 10 years have sort of been characterized as there's this new trend of Black figuration in painting, and they were like, people, it's not a trend. It's a tradition, it's history. And since Kunstmuseum Basel participated, I dare say, in this trend, it was my wish to actually bring this show to Basel to gain knowledge and actually for future collection presentations show audiences it's not a trend, it's just part of art history.
When putting together such a large show, I'm curious as to how you avoid Western notions of universality and make space for the particularities of the works on display and the specific themes, contexts, and ideas that they grapple with in order for them to also be surfaced.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge of any bigger theme show. Here, well, the perspective is not a Western perspective. The perspective is definitely an African perspective. And of course, within the African context, there are so many perspectives. So it comes down to a perspective, really, of Sites MoCA at the moment being under the helm of Koyokuo. So that's just a perspective. I think that's with any theme show you do. You kind of have to take into consideration who puts the show together at what moment in time. Koyokuo is and I'm basically quoting her here, is a absolutely convinced Pan-Africanist. And that is the show's perspective. So rather than a Western universalist perspective, it's Koyokuo, who is Cameroonian-born, Swiss grown up, having lived in Senegal and now in Cape Town, Pan-Africanist perspective. Of course, they are grouped, but the themes that I mentioned earlier sort of came out of the works. It wasn't that my colleagues had the chapters first and then looked for the works to prove the chapters, but they looked at works of art, always with the underlining perspective of Black joy and painting. So it needed to be works that really argue through painting. There are some few exceptions that really come with an idea of black joy or a self-expression. So then the works get distributed to these topics. And of course, there's a certain fluidity in terms of the chapters. So when creating the show here on site, and I worked closely with Tandasani Tlakama here for weeks, we could still sort of change certain works as chapters, just because the overall topics are quite broad and open.
So just to clarify, those sort of narratives and that theme came after the works were selected?
Of course, some works came before and some later,
okay.
But the topics, as I understood, developed out of some key works.
Okay.
Yes.
That's great to hear about that sort of constant, continuous engagement with the works and the stories and themes that they evoke that developed as the exhibition process went on.
And then within the exhibition, it was basically originally a side project of the show that was the collection of historical data that comes with the works, because some of the works, my colleagues knew very little of the artists. Yeah. Some of the works came into the checklist because a conversation with someone led to the idea that this artist and this work should be included in the show. So the curatorial process was very conversational and really relying on a huge network, actually, of people knowing a bit and knowing more and talking about it and sharing knowledge. Also because this specific art history is not yet, say, a Phaidon book or whatever big publishing house would do such a book. It's not yet there. So it was really through conversations, and then also in what works were available for such a show. Like who would lend to Cape Town, who would continue to lend to Basel also, and what works could be brought together. So just as a footnote, and because many people ask about it, and also Koyo refers to the Kerry James Marshall effect, that sort of is around 2000, a bit later, sort of the initial spark for this trend. And there's no Kerry James Marshall in the show because Kerry James Marshall is just out of reach for institutions at this moment in time. And the two Kerry James Marshalls that my colleagues were offered to include in the show absolutely didn't qualify for the topic of Black joy. And so my colleagues collected all these historical data that sort of aligned in a timeline, and that timeline is also accessible in our exhibition. So if audiences would like to engage and sort of understand where certain artists might have met, what were moments of culmination of cultural expression, they could go back to the timeline and find it there. And the timeline kind of starts in 1804 with the Haitian Revolution. So it ties the works and the artists back to all kinds of moments of positive self-definition in a way. It's political events, it's cultural events such as Festak in 1977 in Nigeria, or it's also sports events.
Yes. That's great to hear about that historical context that the exhibition is rooted in as well. Works in the last room here include Sundials and Sonnets, which features a woman reclining on a sofa, but also a work by Mark Perdue, All the Light on Me, and Sungim Lengya, Constant 3, which to me evoke ideas of community, togetherness and intimacy, themes which are also explored more explicitly in other parts of the show. How do you envision the interaction of these works with each other and the ways in which the different sections speak to each other also?
The exhibition that my colleagues put together works through certain conversations between works. In the section that you're referring to, this would be next to Watari Motenge's piece. It would be Sandile Chabalala's piece, and a third one whose name just slipped my brain right now, born in the 1950s. And all three show these reclining women, these women very much reposing with themselves in a way. That is a combination of works. That is a wall that sort of is a is set for the chapter of repose. Repose, of course, more maybe than other chapter, also consisting of portraits, because being at ease, sitting somewhere is such a classical way of portraying.
Yes.
So that, for example, is a set wall in the show, and that will travel to the other venues of the show. But then there are other works, such as the work by Sungi that you've mentioned, or also the Kusanai Violet's work, that could technically also be in other chapters. For example, Sungi's piece could be in sensuality just as well.
Yes.
And in fact, I do believe in Cape Town it was in sensuality. So that was what I was trying to refer to earlier. The chapters are fluid to some extent. It's more like to give viewers a certain orientation in the vast amount of works, to sort of group them and suggest themes, topics, atmospheres.
Subscribe to Shade Podcast and listen to all the episodes in this series. Also explore Shade Art Review on Substack, joining the art-curious listeners like you receiving art listings, comment, artist spotlight features and guest writing. Sign up today to receive your 20% off the annual membership. This series was produced and hosted by me, Lou Mensah. It was mixed by Maylee Evans, and the music was composed for Shade Podcast by Brian Jackson. I'll see you next time.